Hello, and welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week, the first week of 2024.
Yes.
So what are you bringing to the table today?
Well, first of all, Happy New Year.
Happy New
And
Year.
Happy New Year to everyone listening. We're so excited to be back. I have brought a really incredible documentary to the table for us. The documentary is called South to Black Power, and it came out late last year on HBO, so folks can find it there if they want to check it out with us. It's based on a book by author and op-ed journalist Charles M. Blow called The Devil You Know, A Black Power Manifesto. And it builds on his argument in that book that the only way for Black people in America to rise above white supremacy and to gain the political power that they deserve is to move south, right? To move to southern states where there are the highest percentages of Black people currently living. And this idea or theory of a great migration in reverse is how they refer to it, how he's referring to it. So this documentary is all about Charles Blow's exploration. Like, he actually gets in a car and travels to lots of these states. He's sort of exploring this great migration in reverse theory through some community events and meetings with family, colleagues, community activists, politicians, some friends of his, in lots of these states, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, to really try to put his idea out there and to ask people sort of what they think about it, to get their input on it. But again, really to put the idea out there as a potential way to secure power and liberation for Black people. You know, this to me was a really compelling film. I thought it was really thorough in making this argument and using history and case studies and people's real lives from these various southern cities and states to bolster his argument as something Black people should consider. So I'm overjoyed to be talking about this film, again, our first episode in 2024. Where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting concept overall.
Yes.
And compelling film about reverse migration and how it's already happening.
Right.
And he's just encouraging it. I think he said he wants to give it a boost.
Yes.
At one point. But the opening argument he makes, I think, was really compelling. And I have to think about it, you know, as a white person sitting there and watching that, I was like, all right, well, what is compelling to me about this? And, and I think that Black political power, I truly believe this, is in my best interest as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that it's more likely we would see benefits across all areas of government services that would ultimately be better for everybody, including myself and my family and my friends. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why it's compelling to me is it's gonna upset the apple cart in some ways.
Yes.
Where it's going to change the ways that things are operating.
Absolutely.
And I think that is overall going to be a good thing.
It's a good thing, right? Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things that he says at the very beginning is that people are afraid when people say Black power because they compare it to what people mean when people say white power.
Right.
And I think that's such an important point to make, and he makes it almost immediately at the beginning of the film and gets it out of the way because they're not the same things. Those aren't the same demands. Black power within a structure like we have in the United States simply means having an actual voice in the decisions that get made around policy and spending and distribution of resources, rather than having all of that dictated to you by a white power structure that doesn't let you have a voice in that. And I think that's an interesting idea on how to subvert the power structure that does exist and how it currently exists without sort of having to start from scratch.
Right.
100%. And I think that there are lots of potential pitfalls in this concept too, because I think identity can't always be politics. Those things don't always equal each other.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we could elect and follow some people who seem really great and they end up becoming really terrible and regressive and just a repeat of the power structures that currently exists.
Right.
And reinforcing what currently exists. And people who aren't here for community and freedom like we might have hoped they would have been.
Absolutely.
And so I think there's there's complications to it, but there's complications to everything.
Absolutely.
And so that was one of the things I was thinking about as he was talking about this is yes, and as we go through these things, you have to be mindful of who is it that we're promoting into these positions? Who are we following and electing, and et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a really great point when you said that piece about you can't just directly connect race to this, right? Because there have been plenty of Black folks in positions of power. Think about the mayor of New York, right? Like, just because it's a person of color there does not cure everything, right?
Yeah.
It is about the person behind, who that person is and what they believe in and their character and, if they're in the struggle with us.
Yeah. But, to use the Supreme Court as an example.
Oh, yeah.
Clarence Thomas's presence on the Supreme Court has turned that court like into the most progressive thing. I'm sorry, I couldn't get through it.
Wow.
I was trying to tell a joke. And,
wow. I was looking at your face like, where are you going? Oh, okay. This is a joke. What the people couldn't see.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you brought up the
Clarence Thomas?
No. Brought up his definition of Black power, right? I think that was one of the strongest and most compelling reasons for embracing this idea of the Great Migration in Reverse theory, right? And it's to me, and it's how the film opens, it's centered around his definition of Black power. And, he makes it clear that people struggle with the idea and the notion of Black power because when they think about Black power, they think about white power as a term, as an ideology, what it has meant for this country. And that's real. That's absolutely real. But, to take what you said a step further, his idea and definition of Black power is simply centered around Black people having more of a say in how they're governed and having a say, and I would expand what he said, having a say in how they get to live and how to be liberated in living and in their existence. He talked about wanting Black people to not be burdened by white supremacy, not to continue to be burdened by white supremacy, and talked about how, this is the way it has been forever in this country. And so, I think that was so clutch for me early on, and I think it might compel folks early on in the film to hear that and to understand his rationale and why he believes in this idea so strongly.
Yeah, he opens up with that thesis.
Right.
Those are the first things you hear.
Yes.
Is his definition, why he is pursuing this idea, why he wrote the book. It opens up, I think, perfectly for explaining to the audience of this documentary, this is why I'm talking about it.
Absolutely.
This is why I'm pursuing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so one of the interesting things about this documentary that inspired him to follow through on this was this story about hippies in the 60s.
Yes.
Moving to Vermont. Let me be clear, white hippies in the 60s
Yes.
moving to Vermont and turning that state into the bastion of progressive politics that we know it is today.
Right.
Within just a few years. I
Yeah.
think about 10 maybe. And, now it's just generally accepted that Vermont is a progressive place.
Yes, it
I
is.
think the most famous Vermonter, maybe I'm speaking out of turn,
Let's say that.
yeah, is Noah Kahn, and then after that is Bernie Sanders.
Sanders, yeah.
Noah Kahn is a new-ish folk singer, so that was another little joke for the folks in the know. Bernie Sanders is one of the most famous Vermonters, and is a self-described socialist.
Right.
And so the progressiveness there, it's a real thing, and I think we all kind of associate it with Vermont. And so this isn't something I knew much about, so I looked up a little bit about it.
Good.
And it seems that Vermont's population grew 14% in the 60s and 15% in the 70s.
Wow.
And this was all people moving almost entirely from out of state.
Yep.
And that's a huge change, both in just the size of the population, because before that, Vermont's population had been kind of stagnant and hadn't grown much. And so that's a huge shift if you're going from not much, maybe a percentage or two, or maybe some loss, to 14 to 15% over the course of 20 years.
In a relatively small state, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, as I said, shifted the politics permanently.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot to learn about this movement that led to a huge change in the landscapes of politics in New England, because Vermont, I think, is also making some leaps here in thinking, but influences the places around it as well. And
100%.
so that progressiveness is also it's escaping the borders of
Yes.
Vermont too, and spreading out into other places. And I think that's it's just an interesting case study.
Yes.
And I was glad that that was included as something that he was inspired by, as well as he talked about the Republic of New Africa,
Right.
going to Jackson, Mississippi, and the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi being the direct descendant of one of those people,
One of the leaders.
one of the leaders of the Republic of New Africa, and what that means for him, and how much this idea of reverse migration has been a core concept of his life, and how he's lived his life, and
how he's
decided
trying to govern.
pursue leadership and governance. So yeah, it was just really great to hear all those things that led him to this idea of reverse migration and encouraging that to gain political power.
Absolutely. I had certainly heard of the work of the Republic of New Africa
Yeah.
a little bit, but I did not know about Vermont at all. And so that was really fascinating to learn about. I'm glad you did a little more digging into the impact of that over the course of those couple of decades and what that has now meant, as you say, permanently for that state. And I love the idea of the ripple effect that it has. And so to me, that makes this argument even more stronger than this idea even more stronger. There were several parts of this documentary where Charles Blow was with his family. And I was really compelled by a lot of those moments and those conversations. I mean, at one point, he's just kicking it with his family. It's sort of this cookout. And, I was just in it. Like, I felt like one of the family there. It was just a lot of fun. But one of the moments that I wanted to talk about was a conversation that he was having with his son. And his son shared the story of him being in college and being detained by a campus police officer who drew his weapon. And the way that Charles Blow connected that incident that his son experienced to his mission with this book and this documentary and what he's trying to do, I thought was so beautiful. It resonated with me, and I've talked about this before on the podcast. It resonated with him, and it's important to him because it should be the case that Black boys, as Charles talks about, I would expand it to be all Black children. It should be the case that all Black children are able to live in a world where they don't have to constantly think about proving and protecting and defending their humanity.
Yeah.
And so that conversation, again, just made this more real for me. And I can see the passion in which Charles Blow has for this. The other moment, again, in that same scenario where he's with his family, he has a long conversation with his mother, and they do this sort of walk down memory lane, which I thought was beautiful. His mother was a teacher, and he talks about how it was so powerful for him to have Black women as teachers, and for those teachers to have taught their Black students in particular about the importance of knowing their history and understanding that they have a legacy that's rooted in Black self-sufficiency. That to me was so powerful, right? And was such a huge takeaway from this film. I think regardless of whether or not you buy into this great migration in reverse theory, I think there's incredible potential in the power of that education, that pride, that knowledge of history for Black children to have and to pour into and to pour back into their communities when they grow up, regardless of where they go. Like having that centered in you from a young age, I thought was really important. So those moments in the film moved me in such a really wonderful way, but also I thought were just strong rationale for why he's advocating for this idea and why it's an idea worth considering.
Yeah, I thought that those pieces of the documentary were, to me, the emotional core of the story, and all the other things were great, and they were all case studies or examples or history that gave the logical core to the argument, and this was giving the emotional examples of what it was and what was going on. And even some of the case studies, he went and talked to his friend who's now living in Atlanta, I believe, who works for a bank. And she talked about why living in the South was important to her and how all of her neighborhood were all people who had reverse migrated and come back to the South. I think having been born in the South and then gone other places and then coming back to the South. And so, I really appreciated those stories, and one of my notes was, this is the emotional core. And talked about his conversation with his son, his conversations with his family out on the carport outside of his mother's house. And his some of his family members talking about how they're running for council and they're running for mayor, and they're working on gaining political agency in their community that they grew up in and have lived in for a long time.
And that's important
to
them.
And that's how important that is to them, and how they have to, in Louisiana, push back against the state, and how much the state is trying to repress these things that cities are trying to do.
Right.
And so there's this other moment where he's talking at an event about his book in Mississippi, I believe.
Yeah.
And he says, "These black cities are islands held captive in states that want nothing to do with their success."
Ooh.
And I think that's such a key statement, because it outlines a key piece of analysis, I guess, that I've really come to understand about cities and places in so-called red states.
Right.
They're basically controlled by right-wing authoritarians against their will. And so they're in this constant state of resistance. And these authoritarian governments, these legislatures, don't want to see them succeed.
Absolutely.
Because they are the progressives who are there and are resisting these policies. And so the state government wants them to fail, and fail big.
Yeah.
So they undercut the policies of these local governments at every chance that they get. And they gave an example of shortly after Charles Blow went and talked to the mayor of Jackson. They had flooding in Jackson, and they had the water crisis in Jackson. And that water crisis can be pointed at as a direct failure of the state legislature, because they had been underfunding Jackson's ability and request for funds to modernize those facilities.
Yes.
And then they ended up in this place where they're out of drinking water.
Right.
Like, people can't drink the water. People are afraid to bathe in the water because it's not usable. And so there's a lot there.
There is.
In how much these state governments, and I think this is one of the core pieces of the argument, is it's not enough to just move back to a city. There has to be a bigger, you have to zoom out some.
Yes.
And look at the state and the state structure, and how we can support the municipalities and the local governments by having control in the state governments too.
Absolutely. Right. And that piece is so important that you talk about with the right-wing authoritarians. And the other argument that they made was how those leaders at the state level then also turn it back, and the arguments that they make about, well, look at the mismanagement down there and the poor leadership, when all along we really know what's going on there. And you talked about that. And so I thought that
just
was
the drain on resources. And then when a crisis happens, they're like, well, look, you've been mismanaging it this whole time, and now you can't. Well, no, you didn't give us the resources we needed to make this successful.
Exactly.
And Mississippi, they pointed this out in the film, Mississippi is following almost the exact same playbook that Michigan followed with Detroit.
Yes.
And the water crisis that has been going on in Detroit, when Michigan took away Detroit's ability to manage its own water.
It's shameful. It really is. Well, with that, why don't we shift our conversation over to application, the application part of our show. How does this documentary and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives? So for me, I think this documentary joins a long list of media that we've brought to the table for the podcast that really made me think about and wrestle with this question that is asked in the documentary. And that question is, when is enough enough? They use these words in the film, but when is it going to be the year, the decade, the century where we finally have equality and freedom for everyone?
Yeah.
When are we going to win or come out on the other side of this fight for collective liberation? And so to me, and in the same way we talk about abolition and abolitionist ideas for the future, the application here is the worthiness of this great migration in reverse theory as a way to get the answers to those questions that we need and deserve.
Yeah.
And I think not only could this have a positive impact on the lives of Black people, to your point earlier, I also think it could have a positive impact on all of us, on our society as a whole. Like, when we all rise, when we all do better, we all do better. So, it's one of those scenarios where the application is the film, the application is the idea. But I think there's a really strong argument to be made here for this idea. And, it excites me.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. My application is about power and understanding power and how it works and how our communities can work together to gather power to get the things to meet the community's actual needs.
Yes.
How we get people who share our beliefs into spaces where they're making decisions with the community. How do we ensure that we're not constantly playing defense, which is something that I think is happening a lot in progressive politics right now. There's a lot of organizations who are shifting into electoral politics who never did before, just because they want to keep out. And I think this makes a lot of sense in some ways. They want to keep people like Trump from winning races. And
Right.
that's a huge thing to consider of how do we do that? Because we have to consider all of the avenues that we have available to us to get to the world that we all deserve.
Yes.
And I think that's my application is about power and how we utilize all those avenues of power to get to what it is that we actually need.
Absolutely. And the other thing that makes me think about is what you talked about earlier, and Charles talks about this in the documentary, is the state level power as well, right? And so power at every level. You're right, though. It has to start in the community. We have to figure it out there and how we're meeting and addressing the needs of our community. But that state level power is also so important.
Yep.
I love it. All right. Well, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do when we leave the table today to continue our learning? One thing I want to do for homework is to read the book that this documentary is based on.
Yeah.
Again, it's called The Devil You Know, A Black Power Manifesto. I'm sure there's a whole lot more to learn about the Great Migration theory and Great Migration in Reverse theory with a full book. So I'd love to pick up the book and read it. One of the scenes in the film, you talked about it, he was at the Mississippi Museum of Art, I want to say, and this woman asks him if he still has hope given all that white supremacy has done to this country. And Charles responds to her by telling her that he has a chapter in the book called The End of Hoping. And he gave us a good explanation for what that is. I'm sure you can figure that out. So it just made me want to read the book even more. The other idea I have for homework is just to read more of his stuff. He's got lots of columns and pieces, and they're referenced at one point in this film that he's written for the New York Times. He's written a lot about just societal issues, poverty, Black life in this country. And so I really enjoyed getting to know him a bit in this film and, this idea that he's got. And so I want to just consume more from him.
Yeah, he wrote just a couple weeks ago a piece called America's Thirst for Authoritarianism.
Really?
Yeah. So I have saved that to check it out in a little bit.
Good. Send that to me. So maybe it'll appear one day soon on this podcast.
It might.
Yes.
So all of that, I thought the documentary was really interesting and compelling and made me want to read more of his work. My homework specifically is to learn more about the New Georgia Project, which we've talked about a little bit before here, but also the New North Carolina Project, which we saw in the film as well, and the work that they're doing in their respective states and how they're building political power for their membership and pushing these states to be more progressive. I just think that's really great work that needs to be done and sort of fits into his point about reverse migration.
Absolutely.
Looking at how they can build progressive power across communities for everybody.
Absolutely.
So
that's great. There's a lot we can learn from those organizations that are on the ground doing the work. Absolutely. I'm excited about that. Very good. All right, well, Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing an article from Hammer and Hope called
Hey.
Black Class Matters.
Okay.
Which was written by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, and it dives into how class has divided the experiences of Black people in the U.S. and undermined assumptions about political solidarity. And so it's a great piece of analysis that I'm excited to dive into here next week because it gets into a lot about how class has stratified Black people and the ways that it perniciously separates people.
Yes.
And so, it should be a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to finishing the article too.
Hey, very good. He's already started it sounds like. Any excuse to read more Hammer and Hope, I'm all for it. So I'm looking forward to that. All right, so with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. And you know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.